Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Marielle Mostello, and I'm a first-year doctorate student here at Nazareth College studying physical therapy. This is my fourth year working at the Hickey Center as the program and social media coordinator. Our mission at the Hickey Center and the International Institute of Islamic Thought Chair for Interfaith Studies is to promote understanding and appreciation of differences through education and dialogue. We do this through seminars, student engagement events, and gatherings like these open to the public. The Hickey Center also prepares its students for their future by encouraging an interfaith education through the interfaith minor offered here at Nazareth College. This year, our focus is on how interfaith dialogue can inform, support, and challenge the consciousness of members of the Nazareth community and the greater Rochester, New York area to stand up for racial justice in peaceful ways. We welcome Dr. Charles Kimball's experience and insights as we move towards our goal of education and inclusion.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabia Chima, and I am a senior here at Nazareth College studying political science. This is my third year working at the Hickey Center as the GCC program coordinator. Tonight, I am happy to welcome Dr. Diane Oliver, Dean of the College of Arts and Science here at Nazareth College, to the Hickey Center. In her over 25 years of academic experience, Dr. Oliver has served as a religion professor, faculty leader, and academic administrator, focusing her teaching and research on theology, ethics, social justice, and interfaith engagement. She directed the University of Evansville Teaching Center and serves as a national consultant on teaching and learning issues. Dr. Oliver earned both her master's degree and her doctorate in theology and ethics at Vanderbilt University. As a brief housekeeping note, we ask that you submit your questions through the chat box and keep your microphones on mute, as our students will be moderating the question and answer section of the discussion later. Welcome, Dean Oliver.
Thank you, Rabia, and welcome to all of you to our evening with Dr. Charles Kimball here at Nazareth College. I'm so pleased to have you all here, even if virtually. I'd much rather be gathered together in one of the great spaces at Nazareth College and hope we can do that again at some point soon. But we're glad to have you here online as we take time to consider how we can work together toward truth rather than fear with regard to the variety of religious traditions in our community, and especially in relation to distortions about Islam. Such attention to truth rather than the spreading of fear is essential to interfaith dialogue and so many issues we encounter in our local communities and beyond. Many of you are familiar with the initiatives that Nazareth College and the Hickey Center and IIIT Chair have taken over the last 10 years and more to promote interfaith dialogue and study, from the Global Citizenship Conference for regional high school students, to academic conferences that further study in this field, to events that advocate for anti-racism and support for marginalized voices from a variety of backgrounds, to events that advocate for the type of interfaith dialogue we'll be talking about tonight that are open to the public. This is essential work for our time, and I couldn't be prouder of all the ways that the Hickey Center and the IIIT Chair, its leader, Dr. Mohammed Shafiq, and all the students, some of whom you've heard from tonight, and others of whom are lurking in the background making these things happen, to engage for all of us across lines of difference and to work toward possibilities for justice and peace in our world. This evening, we are very honored to welcome Dr. Charles Kimball, a true expert in the field of Christian-Muslim relations, whose background, experiences, and wisdom help us all imagine together how we can build a world shaped by interfaith cooperation rather than division and polarization. Dr. Kimball was the presidential professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. Between 1996 and 2008, he served as chair of the Department of Religion and professor of comparative religion in the Department of Religion and the Divinity School at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. An ordained Baptist minister, he received his ThD from Harvard University in comparative religion with specialization in Islamic studies. Dr. Kimball was also the director of the Middle East office of the National Council of Churches and had more than 35 visits to the Middle East in the past 40 years, working closely with Congress, the White House, and the State Department. This evening, he will be presenting some key points of his recent book on Truth Over Fear, Combating the Lies About Islam, a guide for Christians and Muslims working together, published in 2019. I first met Dr. Kimball when I reviewed his book, When Religion Becomes Evil, at a national conference many years ago now, I'm afraid. This book was an important text to help all of us discern a framework for evaluating specific instances of religious traditions that have gone down evil paths. And I used it in my classes for many years. It was an important work to help separate a religious tradition broadly from specific versions of those traditions that have, in fact, become evil, and was very important for combating things like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Dr. Kimball continues his work on how we might address the intolerance that is created in our lives and in our world when we fail to understand one another's traditions or when we intentionally distort them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kimball.
Thank you, Dean Oliver, for that kind introduction, and to the Hickey Center and Nazareth College for the invitation to speak with you all this evening and to have a time for questions and discussion as well. So I look forward to your responses, not only to what I say in my presentation, but other questions that you might want to raise that I don't address specifically. If I'm able to throw some light on those questions, I'm certainly happy to do that. My comments will be sort of focused in four parts this evening. A few reflections initially on the notion of fear, something that's rampant in our society, and certainly including Islamophobia will be the focus of my comments. Some comments on ways that we can move forward toward the unlearning that is necessary, I think, and particularly demystifying Islam for a lot of people, certainly in our society. Comments, not a great deal, but I want to mention a couple of things that come out of the penultimate chapter of my book, Truth Over Fear, on the tension between dialogue and mission. This is a sticking point for many people, I think, in both communities. The imperative of sharing the message, the good news as you understand it, with the whole idea of dialogue, cooperation, mutual respect and engagement and so forth. That's been a blocking point for many people. I don't think it has to be or should be. And so I will address that briefly, say a few things about that, and then conclude with a major thrust of the comments on ways that people of faith and goodwill can move forward constructively. There is no magic wand. There is no secret formula that's going to solve all the issues and challenges that we face. But there are ways that we can move forward constructively towards a more healthy and hopeful future on our increasingly interdependent, interconnected, and far too quarrelsome planet. Fear is obviously a legitimate response to a number of things. We're in the midst still, hopefully moving in the right direction with this global pandemic. And there are good reasons to be fearful of the dangers posed by this pandemic, having lost my brother, a first cousin, a former pastor, and four other very close friends, lifelong friends, this past year. I know all too well how real this dangerous pandemic is. And so we have good reason to be fearful and careful and follow the best medical advice we can get to find our way through toward a better day, evidenced even by our virtual meeting tonight. Being careful and thoughtful is how we come together even now. So fear is legitimate, and I certainly address in the book, and when I speak, I do talk about the reality that there are people in various religious traditions, as Dean Oliver mentioned in my book, When Religion Becomes Evil, which even in its revised edition of a decade ago is still selling well. Unfortunately, because it's still all too relevant. There are people who take inspiration from their religion in ways that manifest violence and destructive behavior. And we need to be very conscious of that, aware of that. I argue, of course, pretty strongly that this is not representative of Islam or Christianity, but it's a part of the picture and it can't be ignored. We learned in 9/11 that it doesn't take very many people literally to wreak havoc on a wide scale. And so even small numbers of people, a very small percentage of extremists who are believing that they know what God wants for them and everybody else, can indeed create havoc and very serious problems locally, nationally, and certainly internationally as well. There are good reasons in the last year, particularly we've seen a number of manifestations much more clearly of some of the injustices in policing, and ways that certain communities have been systematically discriminated against or treated very differently, and issues that certainly are being and need to be addressed, again, in constructive and thoughtful ways. Anti-Semitism is still very much with us. Recall the people marching in Charlottesville with tiki torches saying, "Jews will not replace us." These were not Hindus or Muslims who were marching with the tiki torches. And there's a very long history, of course, of Christian anti-Semitism that is still very much present. A lot of strides have been made in the last 50 or 60 years, especially in Jewish-Christian relations, but a great deal more needs to be done. So there are real issues related to religious bigotry, fear of the other, and so forth, some of which have a basis in reality a great deal, I would argue, particularly when it comes to Christian-Muslim relations, are not rooted in the reality of how these two religious traditions have stood the test of time and now compromise roughly half the world's population. There are best estimates about 2.2 billion people in the world who would self-identify as Christian, and probably 1.7, maybe 1.8 billion Muslims. Take those numbers generally. This is not hard and fast, and demographics are not absolutely clear. And this would include people who would check on the box Christian as opposed to Hindu or Buddhist, let's say. They may or may not be practicing or active in some visible way, but would generically see themselves as a Muslim or a Christian. So generally speaking, we're close to 50% of the world's population. There's a long history of interaction. One of the chapters in the book deals with an overview of the history of Christian-Muslim relations. And there's far more that's positive that many people, particularly in the West, are not so familiar with because of the long history and legacy of negative images and bias and fear of Islam, as opposed to the experience of many of the Christians who have actually lived together with Muslims for over 1,400 years. Certainly periods of difficulty, turmoil, conflict here and there, and we've seen manifestations of that certainly in recent years with the persecution of Syrian Orthodox Christians at the hands of ISIS, for example, or some attacks on Coptic churches in Egypt. But there are today 14 to 16 million indigenous Arabic-speaking Christians in the Middle East. And so this notion that you hear from extremist elements that somehow Islam, and not just from Muslim extremists, but from a lot of Christians who don't know very much about Islam, that somehow the Quran is saying Muslims should go out and kill all the Christians and Jews. It simply doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny, either in the traditions of the texts of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, or the long history of Islam as we know it. But there are certainly extremist elements who are making these kinds of claims, and in fact have done more to attack and persecute other Muslims, even than people of other traditions. So there is that dimension there, but it isn't at the heart of Islam. The very fact that there are 14 to 16 million Arabic-speaking Christians in the predominantly Muslim Middle East, where I've spent a good deal of my life and work, itself tells you that the Muslims in the Middle East never thought they were supposed to kill the Christians, but rather they live together, sometimes in difficult circumstances, but often much more cooperatively than many in the West realize. The events of 9/11, certainly, and subsequent acts by extremists, violent extremists claiming inspiration from Islam, have done a lot to fuel Islamophobia in the West. And in the first chapter, I really detail the sort of set the situation with a number of quotations from our former president now, from various political leaders, a lot of religious leaders, self-appointed pundits, letting them speak in their own words. And you can see the sort of blatant bigotry and racism and efforts to fan the flames of fear generically about Islam that have really taken root. And certainly in my experience, I run into this and see this all the time. At the same time, one can point to a number of things that have happened in the last 20 years that have been very hopeful. All kinds of education programs, dialogue initiatives, the kinds of programs run by the Hickey Center. This is a distinctive sort of initiative that you have at Nazareth College, but there are a number of places around the country where similar kinds of efforts in different forms are taking place, and have really taken root and taken off in the last 20 years. So there are a lot of very positive things as well. But one can't deny that Islamophobia seems to have grown even more real and more dangerous, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's fed by the behavior of extremists. Of course, one of the problems we face is that our media will tend to gravitate towards what is most violent and sensational. We all know this. You turn on the TV on a given night, and it's the car wreck, it's the building on fire, it's the person who got shot outside the apartment complex, whatever, that leads the news. The old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, is all too true. And so one study that was done, I think in about 2017, as I recall, study revealed that 9 out of 10 media reports, particularly in the television media, that had anything to do with Islam or Muslims were stories about violence and extremism. And so that was the drumbeat that most people would continually be exposed to. And if you don't know much about Islam, then you can see how that, reinforced by preachers, by pundits, by political leaders, would lead people to make generic kinds of assumptions. And that's part of what has to be addressed and taken on. One of the things that I do, and this moves into the second point really, is I have a chapter that presents the basics of Islam in a way that certainly I've been told over the years is helpful, is understandable, and I do it through an exploration of the 5 pillars of Islam. When you begin to look at these more closely, and my book is primarily addressed to Christian clergy, to study groups in churches, college, seminary students, but also interested and concerned individuals who want to know more and be constructive elements in their communities. The 5 pillars of Islam, there's nothing threatening, there's nothing dangerous, there's nothing concerning here. In fact, the more one digs into and understands what's going on and why these are important, how this works within Islam, I point out that there are very clear parallels at the heart of the Christian tradition and really all the major religious traditions that have stood the test of time. And so it demystifies these practices. And I'll come back and say something more about particularly Ramadan later on in my comments and presentation. And so part of what I'm doing is trying to help educate. And each of the chapters, the book is very user-friendly with every chapter is digestible for like a study group with study questions at the end of the chapter. One of the things I was very pleased about, frankly, was that Westminster John Knox Press agreed with me that we only bring it out in paperback and keep the price very low. So it's like under $10 on Amazon with their discount. And so I was very keen to say, let's make it as accessible as possible to people. And they agreed with me and followed that recommendation nicely. So looking at that is helpful to begin to demystify and understand Islam a little bit better. And then, as I mentioned before, a chapter looking at an overview of the history of Christian-Muslim relations and why there is so much deeply rooted fear. It permeates Western literature, from Dante's Inferno to Martin Luther. Martin Luther had 3 different books where he attacked Islam, including one on diatribes against the Turks, where he declares the Quran as a vile and shameful book. He acknowledges he's never actually seen a copy of the Quran, but he just happens to know that it's vile and shameful. So you have just amazing examples throughout Western history, especially Western Europe, of very negative images, hostility towards Islam, hostility directed toward the Prophet Muhammad, and so forth. And that is part of what has been bequeathed to those of us, particularly non-Muslims in the West, much more than we realize how much that's woven into the fabric of literature and perspective. An example I often use is that we've learned a lot, certainly many of us have learned a lot in recent decades about how deeply rooted racism is, how deeply rooted sexism is in our society, and things that people hadn't really thought about, just the way we use language or the kind of references that we might have grown up with and don't think of ourselves as being racist or bigoted or sexist. We've had to do some serious, many of us, unlearning of things that have been bequeathed to us. I think there's a great deal related to Islam that's woven into the fabric and has been reinforced in ways that I already mentioned. One of the chapters, and this is the third point I want to really focus on a good deal here for just a couple of minutes, is a chapter, some highlights from a chapter that I call the world we actually live in. There's so much confusion around certain buzzwords. I can't tell you the number of times, and I suspect Professor Shafiq would echo some of these same reflections, where somebody will come up to me and, sort of look both ways and say, it's really all about the Sunnis and the Shiites, isn't it? Isn't that really the issue here? No, that's not really the issue. That is a part of the picture in some parts of the conflicts that we see going on. That's an element, but no, it's not just about Sunnis and Shiites. Or, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the deal, isn't it? That's the sort of key that's going to unlock everything. Well, no, it's a part of the picture. Or the buzzwords related to jihad or Sharia. And so what I do in the chapter I call The World We Actually Live In is ask people to sort of take a step back. Let's look at what these terms mean, why they're important. What's the sort of difference between Sunnis and Shiites broadly, and then recognize how that splinters out in all kinds of ways too. And that, yes, that becomes an important factor. The Shiites comprise maybe 15%, 12 to 15% of Muslims worldwide. But in the arc between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, they may be well over 40% of the population. And there are some real tensions that relate to history and colonialism and who's the big boy on the block right now that come into play with Iran and Saudi Arabia or Syria and others. So there are a number of dynamics that one can't speak of generically, but it is a factor that becomes an important component that has a lot to do with history and economics and injustices and perceived injustices that do tie into a bigger narrative, but it's not something that can be untangled quickly or easily. And this is one of the big problems, that a lot of people make assumptions and make generic references when in fact you need to do a lot more careful analysis in particular situations to understand some of the dynamics and what might be going on. An example that I think helps illustrate this is if somebody in Greece, some political religious leader in Greece, made some outrageous statement as a Christian leader and a political leader, nobody would assume that that's what people in Sweden believed, or Great Britain believed, or France believed. And yet I just named 4 countries that are predominantly Christian historically, Western European. But we know enough about those countries to know that, well, you just can't take something from Greece and assume it applies in Sweden. From the Greek Orthodox tradition to the Lutheran tradition or the Anglican tradition or the Catholic tradition, plus these have different histories, climates. These are, yes, Christian, broadly speaking, but we know enough not to make a silly kind of assumption like that. And yet somebody will make some comment, often somebody who's not even a religious leader, but will declare a holy war, and suddenly that's what all Muslims are about. One of the major points I try to drive home in the chapter and whenever I speak anywhere is that Islam is not monolithic. It's not just one thing, any more than Christianity is just one thing. Think for a moment like this. Anytime you hear someone say, Christians believe fill in the blank. Well, you could fill in the blank with almost anything and you'd find Christians who believe that. Who are you talking about? Are you talking about Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists, Russian Orthodox, snake handling Pentecostals in West Virginia? What Christians are you talking about? It appears that there are about 30,000 specific Christian denominations in the world. There are more than 50 recognized Baptist denominations in the United States. And so anytime you start making a statement that Christians believe as though Christianity is some kind of monolithic entity, you're bound to be correct, but you're bound to be incorrect about a whole lot of other people who see themselves as followers of Jesus. That isn't to say Islam is all over the place. I'm not trying to suggest that, but I am wanting to point out that there is a history here. And while there's a lot that connects Muslims at a fundamental level, the way Islam actually lives, plays out, the different schools of Islamic law that develop over time, the way it's manifesting is dramatically different in different places. And we're now in a time, again, this is something that Professor Shafiq and others could speak to, where we're seeing increasingly a kind of version or an understanding, an approach to Islam in the West and predominantly Christian countries in Europe and the United States. It's taking shape right before our eyes and will be continuing to happen over coming decades. And this is normal. Religious traditions are never disconnected from their context. There's always an interplay between culture and religion and history that's at work. And that's part of the brilliance of these traditions that have stood the test of time, is that they are able to be adapted and changed and updated. And we see this all the time. Again, we know this with Christianity. I was in my first year of doctoral studies at Harvard when the first Episcopal woman was ordained in 1975. That's not very long ago in terms of Christian history. Now, over half the seminary students in the mainline denominations are women. Pretty dramatic shift that would have been unthinkable to a lot of people not that long ago, and is still unthinkable to many Christians in the Middle East, where culturally this is something that still is just considered not acceptable. And so you can see the cultural dynamics that are at work in the two different societies. It's Christianity, but it's playing out in different ways in different settings. And so to really understand that Islam is not monolithic, I think helps break through, because that's where a lot of the stereotyping, the fear, and generic thinking comes from, to assume that somehow all Muslims are wanting to take over the world. They're not. Are there some who are violent extremists or who are ideologues who have visions of a caliphate and taking over the world, like we saw with some leaders from ISIS or maybe Al-Qaeda at a certain point? Yes, but the vast majority of Muslims all over the world aren't waking up in the morning, sitting around a table, plotting how they're going to take over the world. They're trying to figure out, did you get the flat tire fixed? You get everything ready for grandma's birthday party tonight? How are we going to make this government work in our country and this nation state that we're living in? They're living normal lives, just like most of us in the United States and elsewhere, trying to make a better future for themselves and their families and their communities, not plotting to take over anything. But the media is going to gravitate towards whatever is most dramatic and sensational and creates the most fear. And that's where breaking through some of those images and stereotypes. I don't want to elaborate further for time reasons, but one of the things I spell out and talk about in the book is that we do live in a world of nation states. And this is a fairly new development in human history. This is in the last 100 years. That's different. It's something that's a given now, given where we are. We've grown up in a world of nation states, but there's a lot of artificiality to that. There's a lot of colonialism that's woven into the way the state lines were drawn, and some of the conflict issues that we see that aren't initially interfaith issues or religious issues, but they evolve often into that as battle lines get drawn. And so we do live in a world of nation states, and so we have to find ways to work together in the world of nation states. And that's where more specific sort of reflection and exploration, I think, in particular contexts is important. I have another section I don't want to elaborate on here, but just mention, and that is how Islamophobia has become a cottage industry in the United States. There are a handful of people who make a very good living, it turns out, writing books attacking Islam or going out speaking around the country and whipping up fear and hysteria. They get a lot of media attention in certain media contexts. They sell a lot of books. It's become quite a profitable industry for at least a handful of people. And I mentioned some of them and their work in the book, so people can be at least on the lookout and a little bit more aware. Let me say a few things about this matter of mission and dialogue. Historically, the traditional view for most Christians has been an exclusivist one, certainly in the Roman Catholic Church, which is by far the largest Christian community. If you take all the rest of the Christians together, it doesn't equal the size of the Roman Catholic Church. And until Vatican II, the standard teaching of Rome was outside the church, there is no salvation. And by the church, they meant the Roman Catholic Church. And so you had religious wars in Europe. We've had histories of Inquisition, all kinds of things that have happened. Vatican II dramatically changed that. And I have several pages that deal with that. There's a lot more in other places that people can do research. But Vatican II dramatically shifted the focus and opened up not only initiatives in education and dialogue, but also an openness toward other paths to salvation. John Paul II was very much a child of Vatican II. On issues related to sexuality or women in ministry, John Paul was very, very traditional and sort of held the line with traditional views. But in the area of interfaith understanding and cooperation, he was very much a product of Vatican II and was very progressive on interfaith issues. John Paul II was the first pope ever to visit a synagogue, and he did this twice. He was the first pope in history to visit a mosque, and he did this twice. One of the things he did in 1986 was call together religious leaders from all over the world, large religious traditions, indigenous religious traditions, for a day of prayer at Assisi, building on the legacy of St. Francis. In fact, as I talk about this history in one of the earlier chapters about the history of Christian-Muslim relations and the deep and long-standing negativity in the West, there are exceptions. One of the most notable is St. Francis, who took a very different view and reached out and even traveled across the battle lines during a crusade to meet with the Sultan in Egypt. St. Francis, and I think it's not insignificant that the current Pope took St. Francis as his namesake and has picked up where John Paul left off. Pope Benedict was a little less enthusiastic about interfaith relations than John Paul and Pope Francis seem to be. But Pope Francis is very much picking up that sort of legacy. So there's a great deal there that's quite heartening. And in that chapter, and I won't elaborate in great detail here, I talk about this tension between mission and dialogue. Christianity and Islam are two of the three great world religions that are missionary in orientation. In other words, woven into the heart of these traditions is the expectation that you will take the good news out and share it with other people. If you're a Muslim and you affirm that God's final revelation has come through the Prophet Muhammad, and that this tradition has given you a framework for how to live and be one day found pleasing or okay when you come to the great day of judgment by seeking to know and do God's will, then you want to share that with other people. You should share that with other people. Similarly, Christianity is a missionary religion to take the message of the gospel out to everyone and share that good news. The third tradition that's missionary in orientation is Buddhism, historically never as aggressively missionary as many of the Christians and some of the Muslims had been historically. But the other religious traditions, interestingly, the Hindus with a few minor exceptions, Jews, most other religious traditions are not. I mean, nobody's going to knock on your door and invite you to become a practitioner of Shinto. Somebody will invite you to be a Jehovah's Witness or perhaps a Mormon or a Baptist, but nobody's going to invite you to become a Taoist at your front door. That's not part of the tradition. You could become one if you want to, but you have to kind of work at it, right? Well, that creates a kind of tension because that built into that is a kind of tradition that has led toward exclusivity. And one of the things that's very heartening, I think, in the last 50 or 60 years, and again, I think Dean Oliver could speak to this quite well, has been a major focus of Christian theological reflection has been in this area of how do you understand particularity and pluralism? How do you understand your own faith and tradition with integrity, with thoughtfulness, with sincerity, with depth, but at the same time, reflect on the fact that your truth may not be the only truth or the only thing operative, or there might be another way of understanding what has traditionally been packaged in a more exclusivist kind of way. So in the Catholic tradition now, the official doctrine and teaching, which hasn't always filtered down to churches, as I've discovered over the years, but from Vatican II, is an inclusive theology, an understanding that Jesus is the way, but may not be the only way. And so how might that work? That's still being discussed and worked out and theologically reflected on. The two pluralist sort of views that affirm different traditions as having validity. So there's a lot of work that's been done in that area, and it's not a given. This is very anecdotal. This is not scientific, but I've spoken in churches and universities all over the country for many years, and I've asked probably 30 or 40 different Presbyterian clergy at very large churches and some not so large churches all over the country, the question, what percentage of Presbyterian clergy would you guess are universalists who believe that everybody is going to be okay in the end? And most people seem to think it's somewhere 60 to 70% of Presbyterian clergy. Now, this is amazing, considering that this is a tradition built on Calvinism, which certainly did not see universalism as the outcome, that everybody's going to be okay. So there's a great deal that's going on theologically. And to wrestle with that, think about that, and to see some of the really profound statements that have come out, particularly from the Vatican and the World Council and from other bodies that one can explore, to see that it is possible. In fact, this is not an either or, but one can be a person of faith and bear witness to the truth as you understand it, but at the same time be open and engaging and respectful of others. And I think that's really the way one has to proceed or should proceed, that if you wish for someone to listen to what you think is ultimately important, you should be willing to listen to what they think is ultimately important too, and engage those questions thoughtfully and respectfully. Let me just read one little quotation I think that's pretty amazing to reflect this, and then I'm going to move to the last part of what I want to focus on formally. And that is, this is a brief excerpt from a speech that John Paul II gave in 1986. Now think about that for a moment. We're talking 35 years ago. Pope John Paul II is speaking to a group of 80,000 Muslim youth at a soccer stadium or football stadium in Casablanca. So he's in Morocco speaking to 80,000 Muslim youth, the Pope. And this is what he said 35 years ago. Think about that in the context of Islamophobia and things that are going on today. John Paul II said this: "We believe in the same God, the one God, the living God who created the world. In a world which desires unity and peace, but experiences 1,000 tensions and conflicts, should not believers come together? Dialogue between Christians and Muslims is today more urgent than ever. It flows from fidelity to God. Too often in the past," he said, "we have opposed each other in polemics and wars. I believe that today God is inviting us to change old practices. We must respect each other, and we must stimulate each other in good works on the path to righteousness." That's the Pope 35 years ago. Words that couldn't be more relevant, I think, today. But how do we move forward? Some of this, for those who are already active and involved with the Hickey Center and programs there at the college, will not be new information, but I want to reiterate or point out things that are very important. And first and foremost, I would say, is education, education, education. There's just a great deal, and that's a large part of what I've already been talking about, of unlearning that needs to be done, but also clarifying and learning more respectfully about other religious traditions, in this case, Islam in its diversity in the US and elsewhere. There's a great deal that can be, I think, countered in terms of Islamophobia with education. And education takes place in a lot of different ways. Certainly courses, seminars, studies, study groups, etc. but organized, intentional dialogue programs. And one of the things I lay out are different types of dialogue programs, ways that we've learned that can be helpful in structuring these programs, how to work and plan them together across the people in both traditions at the same time. Some of the things that have been discovered not to be as successful as others. And so where you can begin in less threatening ways to begin to engage with other people, and dialogue and engagement with people in other ways too. Specifically, one of the things that has been most productive, I found, in the last, well, especially the last decade, are interfaith iftars, opportunities for Christians and Muslims, and sometimes Jews, Muslims, and others to be, or for Muslims to include other people in a celebration of the breaking of the fast of Ramadan during one of the nights of Ramadan, and inviting the interfaith community in to learn more about Islam, to learn about Ramadan, what it's about, how it works, why it's so important as a form of spiritual discipline and understanding and awareness that we depend upon God. Everything we have comes from God. Raises questions of what are we doing with the resources we have when we experience hunger and thirst and want, realizing that for many of us, that's not a daily reality. For many people in the world, that is a daily reality. And so what are we doing about that? What are we doing with the resources that God has given us? That's part of the reflection that should come from the practice of fasting. I was sharing with the class this afternoon an experience I had in my doctoral program. I spent a year in Cairo, 1977 and 78. Happened to be the year that Anwar Sadat, October of 77, went to Jerusalem and began a peace process. So it was a very dramatic time in the Middle East. And Ramadan fell in August that year in Cairo when it was 108 degrees and the 14 hours of sunlight. And I saw how demanding, I'd studied it, I knew all about it intellectually, but when I actually saw people trying to practice the fast under such extreme circumstances, it was really very powerful and compelling. What I hadn't understood or realized before, and this is, I think, one of the values of studying different religious traditions, that it sometimes helps you see a lot of things that are present in your own tradition that you've never seen before. I could launch off into an entire 2-hour lecture on the Buddha, for example, things in the wisdom of the teachings of the Buddha that I find so powerful and profound, but also present in different ways in my own tradition that I just hadn't seen until the Buddha kind of opened my eyes to it. This is my experience with Ramadan. Growing up Baptist, as I like to joke, Baptists prefer Wednesday night suppers to fasting. And so we didn't do a whole lot with fasting in the Protestant tradition, but the Catholics and the Orthodox Christians have always had this as a very important component of their faith. Well, of course, as a student of world religions, this is very central in the Buddhist tradition and Hindu tradition classically. Jews fast on Yom Kippur and so forth. So there's a theme that runs through all traditions that somehow physical self-denial is a vehicle for spiritual insight, perhaps spiritual growth, even spiritual power in some way. Well, this is not something that ever really registered with me very personally. I knew about it intellectually, but it wasn't a part of my personal religious experience until I experienced Ramadan in Egypt. And I remember vividly reading one day, I was reading the Gospel of Mark, and I read a passage that I'd read 20 times at least before, where Jesus sends the disciples out to heal people and cast out demons. And they come back and basically report that there's one demon that's pretty nasty and they can't, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, they can't quite cast this one out. And Jesus says, yes, some of them can only be cast out through prayer and fasting. And it hit me like a 2x4. Like, wow, there's the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is connecting prayer and fasting with spiritual power. And I'd never seen that before. It never occurred to me to read what that actually was saying and take it seriously. And so I use as an example too, that even within my own tradition, as an active practicing ordained minister, I saw something in the New Testament I'd never seen before, but certainly the Catholics and the Orthodox Christians didn't miss it all along, but many of the Protestants had. that it really took Islam to kind of open my eyes and Ramadan to open my eyes. We've had a number of interfaith iftars in Oklahoma, my home state, where I've been the last 12 years, till moving back to North Carolina last summer, that have been wonderfully successful and very enriching events, eye-opening in all kinds of ways. I'll give you two quick examples of this. My alma mater is Oklahoma State University, even though I taught at the University of Oklahoma. At Oklahoma State, the president, about a decade ago, got a hold of me and also the imam in Oklahoma City, a very close friend of mine, and asked us if we'd come up and speak, because he wanted to host an iftar, because they knew there were a fair number of Muslims on the campus and thought it would be appropriate for him as the president to host an event. And so I thought this was a great idea. We went up. Even he was surprised when over 300 people showed up for the dinner and the event. He was stunned, even as the president of the university, to discover there were 42 Muslims on the full-time faculty at Oklahoma State University. There are more than 40 at the University of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is about as red a state as there is in the country. Very traditional, very conservative, very Baptist. That's the predominant tradition there. And this was stunning. That he knew there were a number of Muslims, but he had no idea there were that many. The head of the student union, all kinds of staff people came to this event and were deeply, deeply appreciative to be recognized by the president in this way. I could tell you some wonderful stories of things that flowed from that. There's now a beautiful mosque that's just off the campus. It's right adjacent to the campus now, that's been constructed, and he was there for the opening of the mosque, as other people have just been integrated into the campus in a beautiful way. And this is a very conservative, traditional, Oklahoma State's a very traditional sort of school. It's not one of the more progressive college campuses around, and yet there's been a great deal that's been accomplished and is being accomplished through interfaith work because of his leadership. And that iftar was a real opening, a real opportunity to engage people, to draw them out. And we found at the University of Oklahoma, where we've had a number of events, the Muslim Student Association does a program, it's another one I wanted to briefly mention, called Think Fast, where they invite people on the campus, students, faculty, staff, whomever, to fast for a day, not to take any food or drink anything during the daylight hours, to take the money that they would have spent on food and beverages and donate that to some charitable cause. Doesn't have to be a Muslim cause or a Muslim organization, just anything charitable that you want to contribute to, and then come together in a large gathering place for a big, robust, beautiful meal after the sun goes down and learn more about Ramadan. Every time they did this, we had 500-600 people come to this event. And it was very, very powerful, eye-opening, as a lot of people recognized fellow students, faculty members, and others who hadn't been identifying themselves particularly as Muslims, but also to learn something of that experience and what it's about and why it's so powerful, why it's so important. Things like that, I think, are, and my point here is, it's a very powerful form of education. Anything we can do that helps put a human face on the other, breaks through the kind of stereotypes, misinformation, biases, monolithic thinking that so dominates many people. One final thing I would say, and that is to look for opportunities, and again, this is things I think that you're already doing there, but look for ways to work together on issues of common concern. If you think about this, we're already doing this at every level. Right now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Nobody is asking, well, wait a minute, are you a Muslim or are you a Hindu before you get this vaccine? Nobody is asking doctors who are doing research on the vaccines or the variants or whatever, well, what's your religious tradition? What's your religious faith? I don't know if I can trust you because you don't understand Jesus the same way I do. No, the issue is the pandemic. It's a medical issue. And so we don't think anything about working across religious lines to address the issue. We have to be working more collectively around the world on issues of climate change. This doesn't affect one religious tradition. This is the environment we all live in. and share. In the economic realm, if you just stop and think, already every day people are working across religious lines and not thinking anything about it. My argument is we have to be much more intentional about that when operating within our own religious communities, and specifically to be doing the things that we're doing the rest of the time without thinking about it that way, intentionally. And so working together as Christians and Muslims and Jews and others with food pantries that are helping people in need, working together on one of the things that's been done all over the country is that communities of faith, Christians, Muslims, Jews, coming together to build Habitat for Humanity houses. It's a great way to work together on something. You don't have to agree theologically on Jesus to bring the best of who you are in your faith to a project that's going to help people who need housing. And what I found over decades now is that when the more people engage in these sort of activities, where, as Pope John Paul said, we should be encouraging each other towards good works on the path to righteousness, that we compete with one another and work together for good works, then I think we live into our theology in a much more wholesome and healthy way. Let me conclude with a quotation from the Quran, which I like to do because not many Baptist ministers will quote the Quran as their final word for the evening. And it's this, in the 5th chapter, the Quran, a passage in the Quran says, "If God so willed, God would have created you one community. But God has not done so in order that God may test you. Therefore, compete with one another in good works. To God you will all return, and God will tell you the truth about that which you have been disputing." I think that's a very healthy, wonderful way to think about religious diversity. It's affirming religious diversity as part of God's plan. I don't know for certain that it's part of God's plan, but it is the reality that we have. And so be the best Christian, be the best Muslim, be the best Jew that you can be, and we'll let God sort out the differences later on. I think that is reflected also in the John Paul statement and his activities and behavior. And watch closely, I think you'll see a lot of that coming from Pope Francis as well in coming months and years. So let me stop with that and see what kinds of questions or comments or things people might want to challenge that I've said. Great question. I would say several things, but let me just be very brief for time constraints here. One, I agree. Even though most of us were probably raised by mothers who told us not to talk about religion and politics in public, I think we have to be willing to talk about difficult issues. And I think the stakes are too high for us to be quiet, silent, and therefore seemingly acquiesce to the kind of racist and bigoted comments that we often hear. And so I think, yes, we should speak up. And I do this personally a lot. When I hear someone in public say something, even I'll go up to them and call and say, wait a minute, I happen to know a lot about Islam. And I couldn't help but overhear what you were saying, since everybody around could just hear you. And what you're saying is incorrect and very unhealthy and unhelpful. And then engage the person. Sometimes my spouse runs for cover thinking I'm going to get decked. And there have been a couple of times that I almost did. But for the most part, people sort of catches people by surprise that, and then we start a conversation. And I shared this with the students earlier today, so I'll be brief here. A few of them are probably with us tonight. Oftentimes at a certain point in that conversation, I'll say, well, do you know any Muslims personally? And it's usually, well, yeah, there's that I think so. That guy Muhammad at the CVS, who's the pharmacist, he's a really nice guy. I think he's probably a Muslim. I say, well, if his name's Muhammad, there's a pretty good chance he's a Muslim, yes. And he's a really nice guy. Well, what are the odds? 1.8 billion people, and you found the nice one. And of course, occasionally it goes right over their head, but a few times people go, oh, yeah. So when you actually know a human being, they don't fit the stereotype. What does that tell you? Let's talk about that. So yes, I do think we need to speak up and address issues as we do with issues of racism, anti-Semitism, sexism. There are a lot of things that we have to be, willing to talk about in a thoughtful and caring kind of way, but in a way that's firm. Yeah, it happens a lot. There are, well, yeah, I have to watch myself here because I could go on a long tangent here. Yeah, I don't expect that everybody is going to agree with me. A lot of people don't when I speak in churches and different settings. Many people do. A lot of times people are sort of self-selecting who will come to programs and events like this. But there are a lot of people too who will come kind of loaded for action and want to challenge things. And my approach is, let's be fair-minded. Let's turn this around. Think about an example that I like to use is if I'm speaking, say, in the church and there's some pushback, I say, let's think about it like this. If we were in Bangladesh or Pakistan and you're all Muslims and I'm a Muslim who studied Christianity and I'm going to teach you now about Christianity, hold that image right now, come back to where we are right here and ask yourself, what is it you hope that Muslim would be saying about Christianity? Well, you would hope that the person would be telling other Muslims things that most Christians would generally affirm. You would hope that he wouldn't just be talking about crusades, inquisitions, Irish Republican Army bombers, torturing people at a prison in Iraq, or flushing a Quran down the toilet in Guantanamo. I mean, you could point to all kinds of things that Christians have done and paint part of the picture, but most of us would be pretty disappointed if that was the picture that was being painted by somebody. That's a part of the narrative, but it isn't what the vast majority of Christians are about. That's not about the food pantry the Presbyterians are running or Mother Teresa or any number of other things that are at the heart of the Christian tradition. So I think that kind of thing helps loosen people up a little bit when you turn it around and say, or imagine, let me speak about my work in the Middle East with Christian minority communities and tell you how important it is for them when the Muslim majority protects their rights. And we live in a country where we affirm, at least in theory, religious freedom, freedom of religion and freedom from government imposed religion. And if we really believe that, then those of us like me who were in the majority in all kinds of ways, being a white male and a Protestant Christian, I should be at the forefront of making sure the rights of others are protected and that people are free to worship as they see fit or to say no to religion. If they think religion is a silly, anachronistic way to look at the world in this country, you're free to do that without penalty. You also have a seat at the table. And so we need to be, I think, living out the best of our ideals, particularly in the 21st century, where the world desperately needs to see examples of how people can live together with diversity and pluralism in healthy ways, since that's the world we live in now. Increasingly, we live in an interconnected world community that isn't going to change, and we have to find better ways of living together than we have in the past. And so the US is, I think, positioned, if we will live up to our own ideals, to show this can work. I think it's a great question. It's a great point. I think that's one that could be explored and discussed and debated with a little bit more than a short answer. I do think that more, quote, progressive people in these traditions would tend to be people who would be more eagerly ready to join in to build a Habitat for Humanity house, let's say, together, and see that religious differences were not an obstacle, but in fact, we have a lot more in common than separates us, and would continue to grow into that sort of theological awareness. I would shift the focus a little bit and say that certainly in the study of the mystical traditions within each of the major religious traditions, there's been a real convergence that many of the people who follow more directly, broadly speaking, a kind of mystical path Sufis, Christian mystics, certainly Hindus, Buddhists, have found their way together much more easily when they are looking at the metaphors that we use in religion in more symbolic ways than getting stuck with literalness of certain metaphors. So the mystical paths, I think, have been one of the places, if you study the life of someone, a famous Christian thinker, monastic, Thomas Merton, he was, at the end of his life, had said he had far more in common, he thought, with Buddhist monks than he did with most other Christians at that point. Paul Knitter has a great book, Without the Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. And so there are, I think there are some things there to chew on and think about. It's a good point. Those are two different questions, I think. For some, and I talk about this in the different types of dialogue, for some, coming together in some kind of a worship setting, interfaith setting, can be very, very meaningful. For some people, it's very threatening and not necessarily the place to start. Although we do see examples of this when there's like a national tragedy like 9/11, or I'm trying to think of a couple of other examples when we've had like mass shootings in public schools, when communities have come together for prayer. I've been a part of several interfaith gatherings that people felt very comfortable coming and sharing their concern for what's happening in our society and to our children and so forth. So that's not formal worship, but it's a kind of worship in prayer and being together as a community. And having, usually in those settings, you'd have people who would speak briefly and offer a prayer from different traditions, say. But for some, worshiping together is very challenging. And so I think one has to sort of know your circumstance there. In terms of rural America, there's a lot of work to be done there. I think part of what we're seeing today more and more, just in our own political process of the last year, certainly I had occasion, sadly, I sold a home and moved in the middle of a pandemic, not something I would recommend to most people. We were very, very careful in the process, but I got a look at several parts of rural America along the way as I made several trips back and forth. And, there's more than one world in this country, and the sort of anger and fear and so forth is quite distinctly different in some parts of the country. And some of that is rural, some of it's related to that. So I think one of the most important things, and I run into this a lot, I'm not sure how much you experienced it there, but I had a lot of students at the University of Oklahoma who were first generation students, and they would take my classes and really get excited, but then come and talk to me because they were getting a lot of heat from parents and pastors and others in their small hometown, that this is just, none of this is true, that this is all, their minds were being infiltrated with terrible thoughts by learning about other religious traditions and so forth. And it was very difficult for some. So I think it's important. Part of what I've done a lot, and again, this is more specific, but the imam in Oklahoma City, Imad Inchazi, who's a very dear friend, he and I have done 75, 85 programs in churches all over the state of Oklahoma, and universities and Rotary clubs and all kinds of things. So we've gone to a lot of smaller communities, and that's really been very productive. People, are much more open, and if they're able to ask questions, and we always begin, he does especially, to say, ask anything, don't hold back, hit me with your best shot. What do you want to know? And don't pull your punches, tell me what you're thinking and what your neighbors are saying, and let's talk about the things you're hearing and think about. And so I think if you can get an audience, if you get an opportunity, then programs like that can be a helpful step. But that's a long-term process, I think. Is that directed to me or to someone else?
Yeah, I'm going to address that.
Okay.
You may not know, Dr. Kimball, we made an agreement together, the Catholic community and the Muslim community here in Rochester, in 2003. And that agreement we signed together as mutual cooperation, and the two communities will work together. And Bishop Matthew Clark signed it, and there were others, priests also who signed it. But on behalf of the Catholic community and myself and others, Muslim imams signed it on behalf of the Muslim community. It's a beautiful document. We have that document at the Hickey Center website also. And that we continued dialogue since then. The dialogue actually stopped because of the COVID-19. I mean, especially gatherings, bigger gatherings, as well as the group gathering. They didn't know, they stopped it. They said, well, because of the COVID, we cannot meet in face, so let's wait. But the COVID has, now they are talking together to recontinue it, maybe online. So the Jewish-Muslim dialogue is still happening. And in fact, on the 28th, they have the religion and the impact of COVID on religions. So that is on the Jewish-Muslim dialogue, which is happening. So there is quite a bit in Rochester, which is happening. And this is Catholic Muslims. And also there is another one, Christian-Muslim dialogue. That is also, I mean, that will start very soon again. But that we started in 1994. And it had a great impact. In fact, what you said about Oklahoma, 300, 400, on different topics, people will come together. And similarly, after breaking fast dinners and other things which happened. One thing which I liked was soon after 9/11, breaking bread together. Every evening, 200, 250 people will come together. They will bring their own food. The only restriction was, please don't bring pork and things like that. But they will bring their food, and some would come from Islamic Center. We would all eat together. Every evening, almost that happened for a while. So anyway, Rochester is pretty rich. And that's why Nazareth College is having the Hickey Center and the IIIT chair. And that's why we have our dean with us and many others who are part of the dialogue, who would like to see how Nazareth can grow, and not only Nazareth, actually how we can be having improving dialogue throughout our country and internationally as well. So it's a beautiful thing the way it has happened in Rochester area also.
Yeah, let me make two quick comments there. Yes, and I talk about many other things in my book. It was a program began by a Methodist church in Tulsa, where they 4 times a year, now it's grown into the Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, it's a wide community, where 4 times a year in a different setting, it might be in the Islamic Center, or it could be one of the large churches, whatever. They have programs where there'll be a speaker. I've done this, but only for like half an hour or so. But basically, it's just people coming together, bringing some kind of food from their particular tradition and having a large buffet. Now, again, obviously with COVID, this is stopped for now. And basically, people sit around tables and just break bread together. No big agenda, but just meeting your neighbors and opening your eyes to the diversity that's present in your own community. The reality is that in the United States today, any city of 100,000 people is a microcosm of the whole world. If you have 100,000 people in a given city, you've got every kind of Hindu, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Native American, practitioner of Shinto, Taoist, Confucianist, Wiccan, go down the list, Zoroastrians. There are Jains in Norman, Oklahoma. I didn't realize that until fairly recently. So the issues are local as well as national and global. The second thing I would say, and this is, I think, very important, and you're already doing this. In fact, I think when I spoke at Nazareth College at the program you all had a couple of years ago when I was there, you had arranged for me to do a radio interview on a local radio station that gets a lot of listeners. One of the things that I think we don't do enough, and we need to constantly be doing, is anything we're doing, like the kind of programs you're mentioning, make every effort to get some kind of media coverage for it. Most newspapers and even TV stations are looking for positive human interest stories. And so help present a picture that, hey, here are things that are happening in the interfaith community positively. That also helps contradict the sort of negative images and stereotypes. So we need to work more at getting media attention for the good things that are happening, because that too becomes a form of education. That people, oh, I didn't know that was going on. I want to be a part of that. Or how do I get connected to that community so I can join in the next food event that they're having or the next program they're having. So don't forget the importance of trying to look for every way to get media attention. If you're building a Habitat for Humanity house, get the cameras out there, taking pictures, talking to the rabbi, talking to the priest, talking to the imam or whomever, and let them put a positive face on things that they're doing. And it helps people say, well, this is our community too. This is where I live too. I'm the imam, but I'm a citizen here, and I care about people who need housing. Those things may seem small, but I think collectively really do a lot to help educate and counter the negativity. So don't neglect the importance of seeking media attention in whatever forms. Write letters to the editor, call attention to things that need to be challenged, etc. Wow, that's a good one that we could use a semester seminar to address, I think. Having spent a lot of my life and written 2 books that deal specifically with this, with the Palestinian, Israeli and Arab-Israeli conflict, it has been historically a major stumbling block for Jewish-Muslim dialogue. Things can easily devolve into the debate about Israel-Palestine. And so what I've seen, and others can, perhaps Professor Shafiq would reflect on this, what I've certainly seen in the last 20 years is far more openness, certainly on the Jewish side, to engage in constructive dialogue, where Israel wasn't the constant sort of background drumbeat that it had been for so long. There's more openness to being willing to disagree with some of the policies that the government of Israel has pursued than was the case certainly before the war in Lebanon in the 80s. That was a big turning point when you began to see more Jews say, well, wait a minute, just because an Israeli prime minister did something doesn't mean we have to all agree with it. Before that, it'd been like, you never break rank because this could be, dangerous for Israel. There's still a lot of self-censorship, I think, that goes on, but I think a lot has improved there, and there's more opportunity. Certainly, I've seen that with a number of rabbis that I've dealt with in North Carolina and Oklahoma, where there's a great deal of openness, particularly among Reform and some conservative rabbis and congregations. It's becoming less of an issue, I think. It's still there, though.
Actually, in Rochester area, prior to 1998, when we were creating the Jewish Muslim Commission on Jewish Muslim Understanding, there were several settings between myself and 2 other Muslim leaders and Jewish rabbis of the area. And finally, we agreed because we could not go anywhere on the issue of Israel and Palestine. So we said, we are both communities are living in America. We are both minorities. We have problems here. Let's deal with our problems in America. Let's not bring Israel and Palestine into our dialogue. I think that has been very successful. And keeping the dialogue moving in Rochester area between, since 1998, it has been very successfully doing programs, reaching out together. So it has helped a lot. I think now there, I just want to give you one thing. It was a while ago, I think maybe 2005 something. So sometime dialogue would happen at the Jewish synagogue, sometime at a Muslim place. So there was once, I forgot what was the topic, but it was at the Islamic Center. More than 300 people showed up, mostly Jewish and Muslims and some Christians also. And actually, I opened the prayer area for them. And I asked the rabbi to speak from the place where the imam speaks. And he was hesitant. I said, no, I'm standing with you. You stand there and speak from the place where the imam gives the sermon. So that was really a breakthrough, how we are together. And, several times the evening prayer time has come in synagogue, and the rabbi will say, well, one of you should give the call for worship. So that is something unique. I think this thing has helped us a lot. Let's not bring Israel and Palestine. Let's move on. The Israel and Palestine issue may be dealt with people over there, and there are many over there who can talk together on this issue. But our issue is living as minority in America. So I think that's our methodology here, and so far it's successful.
Well, let me just add one other thing, which is another side of the coin, and that is in the 1980s when I directed the Middle East work at the National Council of Churches. One of the things I discovered early on was that in Washington, D.C., where you had every church had its representatives who were doing public policy advocacy in D.C., that they worked together constantly with Jewish representatives of different Jewish organizations on all kinds of issues of common concern. But they could not deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue because the Jewish partners said, no, we won't work on that. And so the churches, with all their policies and positions, were doing nothing, even though their churches had statements and they were involved in Christian Muslim things related to the Middle East and so forth. And so I showed up on the scene and said, well, this is not acceptable. we have policies. We're related to the Christians in the Middle East and the Muslims in the Middle East and the Jews in the Middle East. And so if we can't work in that interfaith setting, we still have to be responsible for our positions and our relationship with Christians ecumenically and in our interfaith work with Muslims and Jews. And so I created a new organization called Churches for Middle East Peace. And it is still going strong today, unfortunately, working particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So sometimes you have to have a different mechanism. If that becomes a sticking point, it doesn't mean you stop working on something. It's you find another way to be responsible there. So I think, but I've been very heartened. I've found more and more people in the Jewish community very open to and eager to develop constructive relationships. And in some ways, unfortunately, I think the dynamics on the ground in the Israeli-Palestinian situation have moved to further back in the agenda, given all the rest that's gone on in Syria and with Islamic extremism and now COVID and possible nuclearization and so forth, that this has not been as high a priority for a lot of countries. And so we'll see where that ends up going. But in any case, it's a challenging issue, but one where I think people should be still concerned. And it is an important issue in Christian-Muslim relations, to be sure, as well as Jewish-Christian-Muslim relations, because Palestinians are Christians and Muslims. And
true. Dr. Diane Oliver, would you like to give concluding remarks? And thank you.
I don't know if I have concluding remarks after all of that, other than to thank Dr. Kimball for being here. His work continues to be important, and just as in 2002, when I began using his When Religion Becomes Evil text, his Truth Over Fear, I think, really provides an important point of attention for all of us today. The idea that people intentionally distort religious traditions and don't seek to understand one another is a real issue in our current reality, and we know is contributing to the polarization in our world. And so thank you, Dr. Kimball, for joining us, for sharing your wisdom and insights. We are grateful to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, and have a good night. And hopefully we'll be in contact with one another.